very warm welcome to everybody that's joining for today's Teams session around menopause. I'm delighted to be able to give the opportunity to facilitate this today on behalf of the NFCC. My name's Nikki Thurston, and I'm really, really pleased to be joined by Hayley Douglas and Bev Thorogood, who are going to give us a really wonderful session overviewing some of their experiences and a little bit about them. So to tell you a little bit more about Bev and Hayley, Hayley works for Cambridgeshire Fire and Rescue Service. She's the media and communication strategic lead there, and has been an ambassador for menopause in her service for some time. She's going to share with us some of her experiences in leading some of that work, and also we're joined by Bev Thorogood. Bev has been a TEDx speaker. She has written books and is well versed in supporting people with experiencing the menopause from perimenopause right the way through in the life cycle. She's going to share and start off our session today by giving a little bit of background of what has taken her on this journey and her wealth of experience with us today. So over to you first, Bev, if I may.
You very much, Nikki. Yes, so thank you very much for having me. Background hasn't always been in menopause, I have to be honest. I call myself a menopause trainer now. It's not a job title I ever expected to have. I don't even think when I started as a menopause trainer 5 years ago, it was a job title that even existed. That was sort of 5 years BD. I like to call it before Davina picked up on the menopause and got us all talking about it. My background, actually, I worked for 32 years for the Ministry of Defence, for 30 of those for the RAF. Not in the RAF, I wasn't in uniform, I was a civilian, and various different jobs within that time, as I think often happens when you work for the public sector, you sort of bounce between different roles. But in my latter years, I was in learning and development, and in the last couple of years before I left the MOD, I was in a training and governance role on an aircraft repair training school. And I really struggled. I turned 50 in January 2016, and I'd started the job just about 5 or 6 weeks before that. And I was gifted my very first hot flush on my 50th birthday. That was a treat, along with a cake and a big badge with a number 50 on it. And that was, for me, the first indication that I'd started the menopause. I didn't have a clue about the menopause. I lost my mum when I was 22. She died of breast cancer when she was 54. So I had no female relatives that had ever talked about the menopause. And I was clueless. So this hot flush hit me, and that was all I knew about the menopause. And I thought, oh, here we go. Wasn't expecting that. And for anybody who's not had a hot flush, believe me, you don't just feel a bit warm. It's like a volcanic eruption that starts somewhere around your knees and evolves out the top of your head. So it was a bit of a shock. And what I wasn't prepared for, though, was the following 2 years of not just hot flushes, but brain fog, horrific brain fog, forgetting appointments, forgetting conversations I'd had, forgetting what I was meant to say when I stood up in meetings, anxiety that I'd never had before, horrific fatigue, waking up in the morning feeling like I'd gone 10 rounds with Tyson, having not slept or feeling like I'd not slept, and yet still having to get up and go into my role, manage people and try and perform to my best. And it was exhausting. And there wasn't really at that time any support within the MOD. Thankfully, things have changed in the last 5 years, but there wasn't any support. I had a very, very good boss. He was lovely. He was a 27-year-old guy. Didn't have a clue about menopause, though, other than to say, oh, I think my mum's going through that, which didn't do my ego a lot of good or actually help me with my menopause symptoms. But he was very supportive, but didn't know what to do because, unfortunately, he'd had no training around menopause either. Long story short, after 2 years of really struggling, by which time I realised that the struggle hadn't started up with the hot flush on my 50th birthday. Hindsight is wonderful. And I realised actually that my menopausal symptoms had probably started to creep in quite insidiously from around about the age of 44, with things that I hadn't recognised as being menopause related. And again, that came down to things like anxiety creeping in, my confidence slowly sort of getting eroded, quite often feeling like, looking back, there was brain fog already there long before the hot flush kicked in, and it was affecting my ability to do my job. And after 2 years, I kind of thought, I can't do this anymore. I asked the MOD if I could have 12 months special unpaid leave to get myself back on track, because I was concerned it was stress and I was just going to end up going on long-term sick with stress. And whilst the MOD quite regularly did approve applications for 12 months of unpaid leave if you were accompanying your partner on posting, or if you wanted a sabbatical or something like that, but they had a financial moratorium on at the time around recruitment, and they rejected my application despite having 32 years of impeccable service. They rejected it, which left me very few choices, or at the time I felt there were very few choices. They did offer me part-time. If anybody's worked for the MOD, I know you're all public sector, when you work part-time in the same job that you worked full-time in, my experience was that you still are doing a full-time job, you're just having to do it in fewer hours. So the offer of part-time didn't really feel like it was going to be a fit. And unfortunately, I ended up resigning from my job in March 2018, so literally sort of 5 years ago. And there's a very strange irony, because I was in learning and development, and for that 2 years of struggling, I'd kind of got a bit nerdy and wanted to find out all about this menopause thing that everybody, seemed to be struggling with around me. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized there was so much more to it than just hot flushes and how many people it was impacting. So I think by the time I'd left work and I set up my business, I actually set up Floresco to help women who were struggling with menopause, but from a health and well-being point of view. So I was a fitness trainer and a nutritionist, and that's how I started to kind of learn more about menopause. Very soon after I'd left the MOD, so I left in the March. In July, I got a call from the HR manager at their head office in High Wycombe at Air Command, and she was looking for somebody to deliver some menopause awareness training to some of their managers and female colleagues at their head office. And she'd been given my name by an ex-colleague because they couldn't find any training provider that delivered menopause awareness. So after thinking for a few minutes about why could I do this? I don't know anything about this. I found myself saying, well, give me a few weeks to put something together and we'll give it a try. And I delivered my first 2 menopause awareness workshops at Air Command in October on World Menopause Day 2018. And there was a couple of things that happened from that session. First of all, I realized that in one session I had 30 women and 1 man wanting to learn more about menopause. And we had a 3-hour workshop, and at the end of the session, the 1 man in the room who'd been very engaged, very brave, but very engaged in the session, came up to me and he shook my hand and he said, thank you very much for that. He said, I've learned more from you and the 30 other ladies in this room sharing their experiences. I've learned more today than I've learned in 28 years as a GP. And he was the medical practitioner. He was the station doctor at High Wycombe. And that shocked me for a start. I was very pleased that he told me after the session and not beforehand. But it made me think, actually, where are we? This is something that affects more than half of the population, and our general practitioners aren't taught about this. The other thing that got me from that session was on my drive home. I live in Lincolnshire. From my drive home from High Wycombe to Lincolnshire is a couple of hours, and I had lots of time to think. And one of the things that got me thinking was, if the Royal Air Force, a very male-dominated, very traditional organisation, is asking the question about menopause, there was no correlation between me leaving and the Air Force asking about menopause. That was purely coincidence. But if the Air Force are looking at this as a workplace issue, is there a wider issue here? Are more organisations looking? So I started to do a lot of research about where are the people delivering menopause training? Were other organisations asking about menopause training? And I found out at the time that there were a couple of other organisations who had already set up training, but very few. And I think at the time I managed to find some statistics that showed that something like only 8% of organisations were actively doing anything to support their menopausal employees. So that's basically where my business started. I started going out networking, and I started to have more businesses come to me and ask if I could deliver some training. I'm glad to say that in that 5 years, we've seen a massive shift in the amount of conversations being had around the subject of menopause. I know the fire service, Hayley's done some amazing work within the fire service. We've had people like Santander Bank, Channel 4, Vodafone, big organisations really leading the way. And then, of course, in the last 2 years or so, we've seen people like Davina McCall and Mariella Fostrop and other celebrities really sort of flying the flag for menopause. But the celebrity stuff is great, but in reality, it's what happens at ground level that really makes a difference. So for me, it's about raising awareness within the workplace so that we all understand that this isn't an illness, it is a life stage that 100% of women and some trans men and trans women and non-binary people will go through. So we can't ignore it. We do see a huge amount of women in the workplace dropping off and out of the workplace around about the perimenopause, menopause stage. And that is at a huge cost to business. It's at a huge cost to the amount of talent that we see and we can nurture. And it doesn't make economic sense for organisations to spend many years nurturing and training and building great experience into their people to have them walk out of the door because they're not being supported through what is in effect a life stage. So that's a little bit of my background. I hope that kind of gives you what you need, Nikki, and I'm very happy to sort of go into what the menopause is and answer any questions, but I don't want to hog the space.
No, that's lovely. Thank you, Bev. Hayley, it would be really good to hear from you, and then perhaps we'll go into that space with both of you, if that would be all right.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nikki. So, as I said in the introduction, I'm head of media and communication at Cambridge Fire and Rescue Service and part of the senior leadership team here. And I think it must be about 5 years ago, I was asked whether I would be we call them ambassadors, whether I'd be the menopause ambassador for the service. So we have an ambassador for every protected characteristic, and our inclusion lead at the time wanted to include menopause. I was kind of 42 at the time, and was kind of, to be honest, it was a little bit of a snigger when I was asked whether I'd be the menopause ambassador. Didn't really know sort of too much about it, but I said, yeah, of course I will. And so I got to reading some books and sort of gelling up on the topic, really. My starting point was to ask in the service whether there was anybody who was going through the perimenopause, the menopause, or had been through it in the workplace that would be happy to come to a meeting where I could just understand kind of what it was like for them at work and their symptoms and how they were impacting work. And that kind of fired the work that we've done, really. I think that it was such an eye-opener to hear the different experiences from people. We didn't in Cambridgeshire, we had one female firefighter at the time, so a lot of professional support staff came along. We had some representation from control. We only had one female firefighter, and she was about to retire. And she was just beginning to go through the real sort of more severe symptoms. And it was a really eye-opening conversation with her, really, that really got me thinking about, if we don't start changing our organisation now and becoming more menopause friendly, the more we're trying to get women up into, or attract more women into the fire and rescue service who are in operational roles. Recent pension changes are going to be in the job longer now through those menopause years. We really need to do something about just making sure that we really understand it and understand the impact of it. So that was kind of where things started. COVID hit, and it sort of, all the focus was on that for a while. So it's really been in the last sort of 2 years that we've really kind of pushed the button under and really started to sort of move forward with what we've done. Now, I'm talking just about what sort of we've done in Cambridgeshire, but what I'm going to talk about, is replicated across fire and rescue services across the country. Last year, I wanted to connect with any other menopause champions in fire and rescue services, because I couldn't see anything on the NFCC that was like a network or anything. So I put a few feelers out there, and a couple of people came forward, and we arranged a Teams call, promoted the Teams call. And I think we had representation in the first meeting from 35 fire and rescue services with the menopause champion coming. And it was brilliant just to all get together and talk about what we're all doing in our services and learning from each other. And those network meetings, they still go on. We've had 3 now, I think, and we're talking about what we can do to sort of help each other. And every service is going off organising its own events. Can we pull together and do something? And that kind of then sparked a conversation with Robert and Peter at the NFCC about what's the NFCC doing? Can we do anything together nationally, etc. And this today's lunch and learn session was kind of one of the things that came out the back of it. But it was just really interesting for me that through the work we've got refreshed guidance in place. We had guidance at the time I took over. We didn't have a policy. We have menopause guidance. When I became the menopause ambassador, that's been through. We're about on our 3rd refresh of it now. I realised that there wasn't a risk assessment if you're in an operational role for some of the menopause symptoms, and I thought, well, surely that's needed. We have one for pregnancy, and if you're looking at driving on blue lights while you're tired, there's actual risks associated with this. So, and hot flushes, wearing BA sets, etc. So we came up with a risk assessment which managers can now use if anybody's going through menopause symptoms, and that's all tied into occupational health. We sent out a survey to all women in our service and to ask them about the impact of periods and menopause at work, the menopause symptoms at work. And the feedback was really interesting, what we got back. And as a result of that, I went to the rest of our leadership team and with about 15 recommendations of things that we needed to do in the service, including looking at toilet facilities, incidents. The women were reporting back. I mean, I heard a story of someone changing a sanitary towel in the cab of the fire engine. I'm like, this isn't right. In this day and age, we need to be able to do something. So we've trialled a couple of portable toilets with pop-up tents, and we just ordered one for every fire appliance, which would be particularly useful, during spate conditions or during the summer again this year. We've refreshed all of our period protection emergency packs in the toilets and on the fire appliances. There's just stuff, just talking about it. And that's been the really nice thing of what we've done in Cambridgeshire for me. It's hearing people just say, oh, as a result of, the session I went to that you organised, I felt I was able to then go and talk to my line manager about my symptoms, and I haven't felt able to up to that point. And that for me is just where we need to get to a place where women can just talk about menopause without feeling, that they'll be ridiculed, or that, it won't be taken seriously, or they're embarrassed about talking about it. So we just literally started. I did the first one a couple of weeks ago, menopause awareness training, which our chief has said he wants mandatory for everybody to undergo. We decided to deliver it in-house as a bit more of an informal way, just because for us it seems that it's going to be quite engaging for people and get them openly talking about it. But I think from a personal point of view, the thing that's really struck me about it is, as I said, I was 42 when I took over as menopause ambassador. It was only when I was doing the work that I was realising I was beginning to tick off some of the symptoms of perimenopause. And I remember we invited Bev to come on to one of our menopause cafe events and talk about how do I know it's perimenopause, because that was the question I was hearing a lot. And Bev was saying, well, there is no hard and fast. If you're over 45 and you're ticking off a number, or over 40, I think it might be, you're ticking off a number of these symptoms, then chances are it's perimenopause. And I've 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and kind of that realization kind of dawns. But because it wasn't the hot flushes, it's kind of like, you don't think it's menopause. I had joint pain. That was one of my first symptoms, joint pain in the fingers and the knees. I felt like a woman of 90 going up and down stairs, and just clicking knees and pain. I'd get to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd feel like I'd been injected with a drug, just needed to go to sleep. Really unlike me. Getting snappy at the kids. Just like, oh, where did that come from, and just mood. I couldn't be bothered. I don't work Fridays, and I was sort of getting up, get the kids to school, and it was like, I don't know what to do today. I just want to sit here on my phone and got no get up and go for anything. And that was so unlike me. And you just realise that this is the start of perimenopause, and I think that's been the telling thing for me, was to get the rest of our senior management team to recognise that this isn't just, women in their 50s suffering hot flushes. This is women in their 40s beginning to start the perimenopause journey, potentially some earlier. And when we looked at the number of women that we had in that age category in the service, it was a bit of a wake-up call that actually this is something we really need to take seriously, or they need to take it seriously. And I've been really fortunate that, they've kind of really supportive of everything we're doing. So, yeah, and as I say, this work has been replicated across fire and rescue services up and down the country. And as a sector, I think there's a lot of work being done in the last sort of 2-3 years, if not longer, for some fire and rescue services. Probably where we're at,
Thanks,
Nikki,
Hayley.
if that's enough.
Yeah, no, yeah, and it's fantastic to hear, and I know that there are other services who are doing similar sort of things to yourselves in varying degrees. What might be really helpful, maybe we could follow up, would be if you were able to share the risk assessment that you talked about and the guidance, because there will be other services that, you know, it's always good to share and look at each other's. I think it's really good that you pick up there around the perimenopause, and it would be quite interesting if you feel that you're able to open up your keyboards and sort of add in the chat perhaps any sort of symptoms or things that you've noticed or are aware with around perimenopause. And then I'm going to ask Bev to perhaps talk to us and start there as part of this life stage, because I think it's an area that quite often doesn't necessarily get picked up, as you mentioned there, Hayley. You know, you start ticking off the different perhaps things that might be happening to you. Not all negative. Sometimes, you know, there are life changes. You might, you know, feel that you need a change and you don't quite know why. You're not as confident and you don't quite know why, or you want to change of direction. So it would be quite interesting. I don't know, with the audience more broadly, some of the things that you've noticed, if you've either been experienced in the perimenopausal, you have gone through and had experience, or you want to, if Bev can talk with us a bit around it for people who don't know what the perimenopause actually is, or how you might know if you have it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the terminology. So if I start just with the definitions and the different stages, that might be easier just to kind of clarify. So we talk about menopause. Menopause is just one day. It's the day diagnostically, it's from a diagnostic point of view, it's classed as the day 12 consecutive period-free months from the date of a woman's last period. So it's literally just one day. Anything before that, she's premenopausal. Anything after that, she's postmenopausal. So it is just the stopping of our periods. And they use that 12-month gap as a time scale to suggest that actually, okay, this is a long enough time to recognise that the periods have stopped. Now, that in itself sounds like it should be quite easy, but we don't always know when our last period was, because we may be taking contraception, might have a Mirena coil or something like that fitted, or we may have had a hysterectomy and the womb has been removed, so we're not having periods. So whilst it's a diagnostic line in the sand, it's not an easy one for some women to know. But in effect, menopause is just one day. What we're really talking about when we talk about the impact of the symptoms is the perimenopause. And I don't know about anybody else, 5 years ago, or probably 7 years ago now, I'd never even heard that term. It literally means around the time of menopause. So it's the time leading up to, and for some, a few years post-menopause, when we're likely to be symptomatic. And those symptoms are a result of fluctuating, changing, and declining sex hormones, predominantly estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. There are others at play as well, but generally speaking, it's the disruption in our estrogen levels that causes the symptoms that we may or may not recognize as menopause or perimenopause. And that perimenopausal phase can happen much, much sooner than we maybe realize. Hayley, you said, you know, once you started looking at the symptoms at the age of 42, you started to tick them off long before menopause was probably on your radar. So the average age in the UK for women to reach menopause is 51, but generally speaking, a natural menopause will occur somewhere between 45 and 55, with about 95% of women reaching in that 10-year bracket. But actually, perimenopause can start anywhere up to 10 or even 12 years before somebody's periods stop. So say you're 46 and your periods have stopped, they've been stopped for a year, so you're effectively having reached menopause. Your perimenopause symptoms could have started 10 years, 11 years earlier, so possibly even sort of mid-30s onwards. So I do often say, if you're experiencing 5 or more of the symptoms related to perimenopause, which I'll mention in a moment, and you're over 40, chances are, without being flippant, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. There might be other reasons, because a lot of the symptoms are also symptoms of other things. But generally speaking, if we're seeing a cluster of symptoms and we're in that age bracket, even if there is something else going on, chances are perimenopause is running alongside it as well. And for me, that's quite reassuring, because a lot of the times I think when we look at the symptoms, we think something more sinister is happening when actually it's hormonal changes. So there are actually more than 40 symptoms related to perimenopause. You can kind of categorize them in 3 areas. The physical symptoms, that's things like hot flushes, night sweats. Some that we may not be aware of, Hayley talked about joint aches, joint pains, almost like arthritic feelings of joint pain. But irritable bowel syndrome can get worse, digestive issues can be worsened or can start, urinary tract infections, muscle cramps, restless leg syndrome, dry hair, dry skin, itchy skin. There's a condition called formication. Just be careful how you say it. It's with an M, formication, and it feels like ants or insects crawling under the skin. Dry eye syndrome, vaginal dryness and vaginal discomfort is one symptom that affects around about 80% of postmenopausal women. Nobody wants to talk about that in general public company, but it can be incredibly uncomfortable. So you've got all the physical symptoms. Tinnitus is another one that often women experience, don't realise that it's related to hormonal changes. We've then got the emotional and psychological symptoms, and some of these are the ones that come in quite early on in the perimenopausal journey, which is why we don't always associate them with menopause. But things like poor attention, not being able to focus as well. I guess we could umbrella them as brain fog, so lack of attention, word recall issues, verbal fluency problems, not being able to get the words out, memory, short-term memory issues, but also anxiety, depression. A lot of women find that they get very low mood, but they know if they've ever had clinical depression, it feels different. It's quite a different feeling, but it's still that sort of loss of joy and just feeling unmotivated, lethargic, not having any energy. And we've got things like fatigue and poor sleep and things in there as well. And then the third area is cognitive. I've just given you all the cognitive ones instead of the emotional ones, actually. So cognitive are the brain foggy ones. I'm going to put that down to brain fog. Am I allowed that? So things like, lack of attention, word recall problems, but low mood. And also on the emotional side, often women find that they get very snappy and get really there's a sense of rage, like this frustration and anger that feels very uncharacteristic. And I think when we've got all of these things happening and they tend to come and go, we don't necessarily have the symptoms every day. When our estrogen levels are high, and our estrogen levels fluctuate quite significantly day by day. So on one day, your estrogen may be very high. You might feel on your A game and feel brilliant. And the next day it plummets and you've got all of these symptoms showing up. They come and go. We can end up feeling a bit like a hypochondriac. So it can be very disorientating. It can be very debilitating for a lot of women. One thing we need to be aware of is that no two women or no two people really will experience menopause in the same way. We can't have a one size fits all, because we will, depending on how our hormones are, we're likely to experience it differently. And I think the other thing is we need to be aware that not everybody who is going through that menopause transition will be symptomatic at all. About 25% of people won't show any symptoms. So we almost have to challenge our own assumptions, about what a menopausal woman looks like, and also the fact that if somebody is of a certain age, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be symptomatic and show those stereotypical symptoms either. So it's very nuanced. It's very individual, but hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview of what it is. One of the questions I often get asked is, does it ever stop? Yes and no. Yes, often the symptoms will settle down a few years post-menopause and you'll start to feel more like yourself, but we have gone through a full transition, a full metamorphosis. We are different the other side of menopause to what we are premenopausal. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end at all. I think once we get through that sort of bumpy road in the middle, many women find that they come back much, much stronger and they've got all of that sort of talent to bring. So it's not the end by any means. So, does that help, Nikki? Is that
It does. And I guess I'd like to ask both of you. So there are these symptoms. What can we do? What can we do to take good care of ourselves? And how do we minimise the impact on our day-to-day, lives? I've had one specific question I'd like to ask Hayley first. And I don't know whether you've picked it up in Cambridgeshire. You might have seen Emma Becker, I think it is, who said one particular one was around hot flushes whilst wearing or involved in BA, which I think is really relevant to us. But there are a lot beyond that, Hayley, that I'd like to talk about with you and Bev around, how do we minimise this impact? How do we still perform our very best, feel our very best day by day, whatever age this starts to happen to us?
I'll let Bev talk about HRT and things like that, though I have to say I went on HRT in December, and I think 3 weeks in, my joint pain had pretty much gone, and I wasn't getting the tiredness that I was getting as well. So I'm quite a big fan of it, to be fair. It's really helped with the symptoms that I had at the time, although, I wouldn't have called them severe, but I was kind of, my personal view and take on things was that if there's something there that's going to help, then why not? I'm a big fan of Dr. Louise Newson as well, who you may have seen her on TV. She's on This Morning quite a lot with Phil and Holly, and she runs a clinic in Stratford-upon-Avon. She's one of the sort of the experts in menopause in the country, and she's been doing a lot to champion workplaces and doctors particularly around trying to improve things for women going to talk about their menopause symptoms. I follow a lot of her stuff, and I didn't really have an opinion either way about HRT, but for me, just hearing the reassuring stuff from her and, the stuff that Bev's told me as well through the training I've had with Bev, that, it was something that, well, I'll try it and see if it makes any difference. And it did. And I was quite surprised at how quickly it did make a difference for me. But as Bev would say, there are alternatives out there as well for things. But the question around hot flushes in BA is really interesting, because I wanted to know whether or not when you have a hot flush, your body temperature actually increases. But there's been some research done. It may have been through the NFCC a few years ago, somewhere, that actually when you have a hot flush, your body temperature doesn't actually rise, although it feels like it. I mean, I've never had a menopausal hot flush like that, not an extreme one. But I did hear that your body temperature doesn't actually rise. But that doesn't stop the fact that you're in this PPE gear and your BA set and you're feeling like you're absolutely burning up. And I don't have the answer, Nikki, to that, to be honest. It's one of the things that we're still trying to assess the impact of is, and it's going to have to be an individual impact for people. But this is where I think we need our organisations to get to a place where people can talk to their line manager about their symptoms and explain the impact that it's having, so that they can be risk assessed and things can be put in place in terms of reasonable adjustments. They can be referrals to occupational health to assess their role and their symptoms. And they're going to be different for different people depending on the severity and the type of symptoms that they're having. There's over 40 recognised menopause symptoms now. Not everyone's going to have all of them. As Bev was saying, they come and go. And so it's got to be an individual assessment. But we've just got to make sure that our workplaces are a place where people can talk to their line managers about it. Or if you don't feel comfortable talking to your line manager, is there a menopause champion in your service that you can go and have an initial conversation with? Could they go and speak to your line manager first to warm them up, and then you then go and have that conversation? Could they go with you while you have that conversation with them? Union reps, a friend, somebody trusted, talk to the HR teams in your organisation to go and get that support. And I think talking to your colleagues as well is what we try and encourage people. Why we want to do the training for everybody, because actually, if you've got symptoms and you're operational in the fire service and they are impacting on your kind of, you at work, you need your team to understand that as well. And they need to be empathetic around, and understand what it is that you're going through. And I think that this is why it's so important that everybody understands in our services what the menopause is and what the impact is and what the impact is at work. I did a session the other day with a watch, and the first question I asked them was, okay, who heard that you were undergoing menopause training today and wondered why on earth you were going to have to endure an hour of listening to that? And I said, be honest, and 3 hands shot up. They were all men in this particular watch on that day. And I said, well, thank you for your honesty, and it was like, right, well, who's got a partner at home? Who's young enough to have a mum in their 40s, 50s, who works with women, and this is why you need to understand, and this is why you're here, and this is what that training's for. And by the end of it, they were so engaged in the conversation, and it was a real eye-opener, I think. So although that doesn't directly answer the question, Nikki, around the hot flush and the BA set, I think, we've got some work to do, haven't we, as a fire and rescue service, I think, to really understand that. And there may well be other fire and rescue services out there who have, they've had operational female firefighters go through it, and they may well have an answer that I don't. But as I say, I think it's just being able to have that conversation, and that conversation with occupational health, and understanding what those symptoms are and that impact.
Lovely. Thank you, Hayley. I noticed that Katie Love had your hand up. Katie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just an interesting one with Hayley. Katie Love, I'm a watch manager operational at Cleveland Fire Brigade, but I'm the chair of the Women's Network. So we're currently I did like a menopause morning last year, which was very eye-opening. I'm 43 and I'm just starting to go through perimenopause, I think. But we had about 30 ladies and maybe it's about five to 10 guys come, and there was tears, there was tissues, there was cupcakes, there was everybody's stories coming out, and I learned a hell of a lot because I didn't know the half of it. And I think it was the biggest thing was you had women working next to each other who were really, really struggling that didn't know the woman next to them was really, really struggling. But from a personal point of view, obviously operationally, I'm going to go to incidents and things, and I'm starting to get bits of brain fog and stuff. And with you saying you did a risk assessment, I thought that was quite interesting, as in, if I did a risk assessment, I think the worrying thing for operational firefighters is, am I going to get took off the run? Because for operational firefighters, I think most of us would know that's like one of the worst things you can do, going on modified duties, going on day duties and things like that. You want to be a firefighter. So, at some point, I'd have to be honest with myself and say, do you know what, I'm maybe not able to be the best decision maker right now. I'm not at that stage. I'm way off it. But in the future, if that happens, what do you do, and what sort of actions are taken from the risk assessments?
So our risk assessment is that conversation with the line manager that flags the symptoms and kind of assesses the impact on the individual doing their specific role. It would then become potentially a referral to occupational health. All the forms are sent to occupational health. They then follow if it's having a significant impact, then it would be an official referral to occupational health to have those discussions and to talk about, what reasonable adjustments could be put in place. We haven't had any test cases in Cambridgeshire at the moment in terms of anything that's gone through that kind of cycle. So, I don't know the answer. I don't know if there are any other fire and rescue services out there that have had something similar.
I'm lucky enough that 18 years ago when I started in this job, there's 6 ladies on my course. So we've kind of all supported each other, and we talk to each other, and there's other ladies obviously come in who know they can talk and things like that, and it is getting better. But it's more of, I'm currently looking at a policy, and I don't know where to go with it. With people saying, well, like non-ops, we can say, okay, if you're struggling with flooding, with your periods, with things like that, you can work from home with a laptop. Mm-hmm. But if you're operational, you can't. And it's trying to find that balance between green book and grey book, but also that balance between you still have to come to work and do your job. And I'm completely lost with where to go with our menopause policy. There's lots of ideas in tying it in with the sickness policies, but do any other brigades have, so it doesn't go on your sickness record, your trigger levels or something, maybe as if you are struggling, or does it have to be registered with a doctor to say that you can book sick with menopausal symptoms, it's not going to be held against you? Is there anything like that in another brigade somewhere?
So what we've done is we've actually put menopause as a category for absence on the sickness reporting now. We didn't have that before, and that's also so we can monitor it, but also so that we can make sure that support is in place. And a conversation we then involve the people team, our HR team, and they would then, they can put things in place. So a reasonable adjustment would be adjusting the triggers for that individual around the sickness process. So yes, there's stuff like that in place, certainly.
Katie, what I would say is things like brain fog, hot flushes, so where at a BA, and the hot flushes, stress exacerbates symptoms. Now, you're in a stressful situation already when you're going into a fire, I'm sure. But if you can remove the stress of worrying about whether or not you're going to be judged around the fact that you're a bit brain foggy or you're having hot flush, your likelihood of having the brain fog and the hot flush goes down. Even just having the conversation with your manager or with the rest of the watch to say, look, there are times when I might need somebody else to give me a sense check on a decision. I don't know how practicable that is, but taken the pressure off you to have to perform at a level that your brain is going, no, I'm not up to this. You've already put a layer of stress on yourself. So by being able to talk more openly about what it is you're experiencing will reduce the stress in itself. If that makes sense.
I'm very lucky in that I am the kind of person who talks about it. I've told my watch they're going to come through the menopause with me and enjoy every minute of it. So, you know, even a couple of the guys have said that they're in menopause as well and they're coming along with me now. So, you know, we do have a laugh and we have a joke about it. I think it's more about the internal pressure you put on yourself. It's like what you were saying. I felt I had to leave the job. And there was ladies that came to the coffee morning that we did who said, I nearly quit my job. I nearly handed my notice in because I didn't know it was the menopause. And that was eye-opening for a lot of people because the people sat next to them in the offices didn't know they were going through it. You know, they were like, what, you were that bad? Because they were making little mistakes. And I was booking somebody sick the other day and I booked myself sick for 7 days. This was 3 days ago. And it wasn't until I got home that I realised I'd booked myself sick for 7 days and not the person I was trying to book sick. So it's little things that are starting to creep in that I just thought, oh, I'm tired. I've had a busy night shift, but it's happening more often. So I've no idea if I'm perimenopausal because I had a hysterectomy 2 years ago. No idea. But I'm certainly talking to it with the other ladies and you know, the people at work. And can you go to a doctor? I don't think the doctor will say categorically, yes, you are, no, you're not. But with you saying things like joint pain, I'm going, take, a bit like you, Nicola, take. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm there. Yeah, I must definitely be there. So the next question is, what do I do about it? Is it HRT? Is it herbal remedies? What sort of things do help for me now? But yeah, I think
it's very individual. Yeah, it's very individual. I'm with Hayley. I think HRT, it can be a game changer for lots of women. I think, unfortunately, I do think at the minute the narrative that we're hearing through social media suggests that is the only way. I think there's an awful lot we can do in terms of our own personal stress management, lifestyle choices, looking after our health, you know, taking the rest that we need. I don't think as women generally, we're very good at taking downtime. So there's a lot that you can do from your own sort of health and lifestyle habits. But HRT is probably the most effective treatment for for a short term solution.
That's what I was going to ask, right? Because I might be a bit naive here, but are you on HRT for the rest of your life then, or
choice? It's an absolute choice. Okay. So when I say a short-term solution, many women will choose to stay on HRT indefinitely, and there's no reason why you can't. But in terms of when I think I probably worded that wrong. What I meant was for the most immediate relief from the symptoms, HRT is probably the most effective treatment. Not everybody can take HRT. The majority can, far more than we think, but there are a small number of women that can't. But HRT would be my first choice if you're really struggling. Herbals, everybody's different. I haven't come across very many women yet who've found herbal remedies that have done much in real time, you know, in real terms in the long term. But yeah, you can stay on HRT for as long as you want to if it's doing you well. But it's a good instant kind of let me get back on track treatment.
Yeah. I'll look into it.
Bev,
thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Katie. Bev, we had a couple of people have their hands up. If I could, I don't know if their questions got answered, but Paul, you had your hand up, and then Anne.
Hi, yeah, Paul Dunn on West Midlands Fire Service. It was just around the question that Katie raised about decision making and incident. So my background is incident command training and assessing, and I think it's got me thinking about it around what we would kind of do for somebody when they're new. They're not able to act in the same way as somebody who's really experienced. So whether it is around raising awareness that and understanding that you might be menopausal and that might be difficult, and therefore you now need to look at mechanisms to support you in that decision making, going back a step maybe to using processes and aid memoirs to do it, to help you come to that decision, to break it down for you. Also, the use of incident monitoring officers that come onto the incident ground, if their awareness is better around that, they are better keyed. So we're trained how to support somebody with their decision making, but not with the element of somebody that might be struggling at this period with decision making, and how that monitoring officer can offer support, because it may be just somebody agreeing with you what you are doing puts you back on an even keel, removes that stress. You go, yeah, okay, I did know where I was going, and your decision-making power comes back, but just because you feel more comfortable. And it's about somebody probably being able to give you that comfort level and say, you're doing it right. We're still on the right track. Might enable you to continue making that decision rather than your confidence falling off in yourself that, I think I'm getting that wrong now, when you may not be. So it's got me thinking now, so certainly for my service, where we'll look at, for me, it's just a reasonable adjustment. Can you bring something in that supports an individual with their decision making?
Yeah.
We try to, but not specifically aimed at menopause, but perhaps we should.
But as Bev said, it is a very individual thing. I mean, an example for me would be, I was at an incident the other day and I wanted the aspirator, but at that exact moment in time when what was going on in front of us, I couldn't think of the word of aspirator. So I just said sick sucker. So I'll start describing exactly what I want because I can't remember the name for exactly what I want. So it's not been the issue because my guys are used to me now and they just laugh and go, you mean that? And I go, yes, so if they'll finish my sentence for me sometimes because they know what I'm trying to say. But for me, it's, if this gets worse in the future, I'm going to have to be honest with myself and go, okay, do I need to step back here and do something about it? And that's scary because that's my job and that's what I enjoy doing. You've got to be honest, haven't you? If it does get to that point, you've got to be honest about it.
Find it's temporary, it's not a permanent state. And if you look at things like long COVID, for both men and women, the symptoms of long COVID and the brain fog associated with that are no different. So in actual fact, you'd be making similar sort of reasonable adjustments or adaptations for somebody who was potentially struggling with long COVID, or, even men if they've had sort of any hormonal treatments as well. So things like prostate issues are often treated hormonally. So it's not unique to menopause. Generally speaking, if you put in an adjustment for a condition, it will generally help everybody. So nobody's going to find it, a problem if somebody gives them a sense check on a decision. So I think generally speaking, global adjustments work really well anyway.
And you also had your hand up. Did you want to ask your question of Bev or Hayley?
It wasn't a question as such. It was just based on the back of what Katie was saying in terms of what my service has done. I'm a operational whole-time watch manager and I'm 50. I'm on HRT. And it was more around anxiety and my stress levels that it was affecting me. For my service, I went to occupational health and they turned around and said, well, on your triggers, we'll give you one extra sickness on your triggers, which I'm not really sure has been massively helpful because that's just a pressure in itself, really. It's just such a tricky situation to be in and you don't want to almost make a big deal out of it because you're so on your own in it all.
Yeah, for
sure. And you don't want it to be a stick for people to beat you with.
No, and I hear it quite often in conversations with different people, the vulnerability that this induces. And I think it's really key that we start to try to take that in our fire services away from people by putting in the risk assessments and that they're trusted as there to support the same way as you would have with other biological, medical, situations, which I think Bev was alluding to there. Bev, there was a question from Lisa in the chat. She says, do GPs need to do a definitive menopause diagnosis based on your hormone levels before you can be prescribed HRT, or even is there such a thing?
There are blood tests that can be used. They're incredibly inaccurate, and there are NICE guidelines actually for menopause, so National Institute for Health and Care Excellence guidelines that GPs should follow. The guidelines state that if you're over 45, there's no need for a blood test. It should be a clinical assessment based on a conversation about your symptoms. A good GP, I think, would probably knock that down to the age of 40 rather than 45, because chances are you're experiencing perimenopause from sort of 40 onwards. So there are blood tests. Generally speaking, they're used if you're under 45 to rule out anything else rather than to rule in menopause. I think the best thing you can do, and is Hayley mentioned Louise Newson. She has a free app called the Balance app, and you can actually track your symptoms on that app, and you can print off a report to take to your GP. GPs have a tendency to see that as a bit more credible than you just going in talking about your body, because obviously a bit of paper is more more important to the doctor than you understanding your own body. But because it's been generated from a GP-led app, they tend to take it a little bit more seriously. But you shouldn't need a blood test. And a blood test, in reality, our hormones are fluctuating so much day by day. You could have the blood test at 2 o'clock and your hormones will be completely different by 6 o'clock. So it might give you a false reading anyway. And if you're having huge amounts of symptoms, but they do the test on a day when your estrogen's high and say, well, no, you're not perimenopausal, you're left with this. Well, if it's not perimenopause, what the heck is it? It must be something worse. It must be something more sinister. When in actual fact, if they'd taken the test a few hours later, it would have given a different reading.
Bev, there's been a number of people who are in the room with us today who have either had a hysterectomy or been involved. And I've got a question here from Zoe. She says, does anybody in the room, either from personal experience or just research into the topic overall, know of any good books or resources for surgical menopause? So from sort of like a hysterectomy. Yeah, she says she's 34. And has been to a number of these talks, but feels slightly out of the loop because this has been as a surgical result. Have you got any advice or help that could help there?
Balanced Menopause app has it, as well as sort of practical resources for tracking your symptoms. There's a wealth of different information on there. There's stuff about surgical, about chemical. So if somebody's had cancer or anything, that can also trigger either a temporary or a permanent menopause. And it's a great resource. So Balanced Menopause, I would definitely that would be my first go-to to get what you need.
Just on the subject of going to the doctors, just again from my own experience, really, I went with the tiredness and they wanted to do blood tests for iron and stuff and was told by the doctor, can't find anything, it's just lifestyle, and kind of sent me away. I'm not very good at challenging a doctor. I never have been. And then my joints got to the point, my knees particularly, they were that bad. Like I felt like they were going to buckle as I was walking downstairs. So I went back. My nan had rheumatoid arthritis really quite early. So I was getting paranoid that I was having that. Did another blood test, that came back clear, no inflammation. And I'm like, well, what then? Something is not right. You know, it's like I know my body, I know how I feel. And I just said, look, can I please try HRT? I said, and I'd listed off, he said, have you got any other symptoms? And listed off a couple of others. And I said, I just want to try it. Can I just see whether it works? And he then agreed. But I think what I'd learned is that you have to be assertive with doctors, I think, as well. And you have to, you know, write down your symptoms because, you know, typically the first time I walked out, I'm like, oh, why didn't I mention that, and that? Because I've got them as well. But when you're in there, you know, having that conversation with the doctor, you know, I go in there, feel like a little child again, really, you know, and the doctor's sort of, you know, the one talking to you. So I think to go in and just empower yourself, if you want HRT and you feel you want to try it, I think that's just my personal advice is you just have to know what you want and just don't be afraid to ask for it and see what the reaction is rather than waiting for them to suggest that, you know, you try it.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Can I just jump in, Nikki? Is that all right? I think there's something that we've probably missed here. You do not have to have reached menopause to be able to take HRT. In fact, a lot of GPs will say, well, you can't be menopausal because you're still having periods, therefore you can't have HRT. Actually, we need it more before our periods have stopped in the perimenopause stage. So if your doctor is telling you can't have it until you've reached menopause, find a different doctor or do what Hayley says and challenge them. And definitely download the NICE guidelines and take those with you because the GP probably hasn't read them.
It kind of annoyed me because the first question they ask you was, well, are your periods still regular? And I don't have periods. And like a lot of women these days, you know, with contraceptive pills and things like that, you don't have periods. So, you know, it needed to be a marker, you know, they instantly go to that. So, you know, it's like when you're filling out or looking at some of these checks online and various, it's about menopause. First thing they ask is about your periods, but there's got to be other things as well. And we move away from that a little bit. Yes, it is one of the symptoms and the signs, indicators, but there's other stuff as well.
Yeah, and thank you. I think that's really important for both of you to raise those points. I take HRT. My mum had a very aggressive breast cancer, so I was really frightened about taking HRT. And actually, there's lots of different ways you can take HRT, and you can find something that works for you. I think is also sort of perhaps unknown You can have it in a gel, you can have it in a spray, you can have it in a patch, you can have it orally, varying different strengths based on what you need. And I think pulling out that really sort of personal, experience and your personal needs can really, there is something there for everyone, and you don't have to. And I word experience it, because I don't think it's, if we look at it as suffering, I don't think that's right. But you don't have to experience it to the levels. There's things that can be done for you. I know, Bev, you were going to talk about some of the other things that you could do that might be there, and I'm sorry if I cut across you, but would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we underestimate the impact of lifestyle. I use a model called NEST, which looks at nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress, and also thoughts and feelings. So nutrition's fairly straightforward, isn't it? I think that basic principles are always good, trying to cut out as much junk food and ultra-processed, highly processed foods, eat more whole foods, kind of makes sense. Exercise, we need to move. Moving helps to move our hormones around the body. It helps to generate hormones. I think the bit we underestimate and I keep coming back to it, is the impact of stress and stress management, whatever that looks like. So whether that's sort of taking time out, resting, making sure you get enough rest, having a community around you that you can talk to, helps to manage that sort of the stress that is inbuilt in the worry around being menopausal. I mean, there are other stresses, of course. We've got lots of stresses in life, but if we can take away the stress of feeling worried about what people are going to think about us if we're going through menopause, but also things like meditation, mindfulness, all of the kind of the soft bits that we know probably will help but feel a little bit strange. Thinking about your time management, saying no, boundaries, all of that can help with stress, but also prioritizing sleep. Sleep is so underrated, and it's very hard. Whenever I'm talking to women who are menopausal and I talk about getting better sleep, I always wait for something to get thrown at me, because if you could get a better night's sleep, you'd get a better night's sleep. But actually, we often don't give ourselves the best chance of a good night's sleep, so sleep hygiene is good. I think what we often miss is the thoughts and feelings bit, how we actually feel about this whole transition, because if we're focused on it being a miserable time, chances are it will be. If we're focused on the fact that everybody's telling us you're going to struggle, you're going to suffer when you get to menopause, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think there's a big narrative at the moment in social media about all of these women who are struggling and really it's like a death sentence, and I think that's a lot of thoughts and feelings. So coaching, counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy can really help, but changing the thought processes, changing the mindset around the whole menopause, not seeing it as an age related thing. I think a lot of people reach menopause and think, oh, that's it, I'm on the downward, it's all downhill from here. I see it as the start of the next best chapter. Actually, we're letting go of a lot of the things that we've had to deal with, like periods and all of that stuff. We're going into a nicer period, really, in many ways, because we're free of some of that. But we need to kind of put a more positive spin on this. Let's face it, women have had menopause for millennia. It's not a new construct. We just need to reframe, I think, from a thoughts and feelings point of view, how we look at this time. And that's not to underestimate some of the symptoms we have to deal with as we go through it, but put it in perspective, I think. I don't know if I went way off tangent on the answer there, Nikki, sorry.
No, that was lovely. And Katie's got her hand up for a question for you.
Yeah, sorry for asking another question, but one of the ladies and a good friend of mine who's in the job, we've had a discussion about collagen, because we're currently I was very poorly over Christmas. I'm trying to get back into fitness. They're struggling with their motivation and, joints and things like that. And something was online about collagen, and I don't really know anything about it. Can you tell us anything about that?
Collagen is a natural chemical that we have in the body, and it is impacted by estrogen. So as our estrogen levels drop, our collagen levels tend to drop as well. So there is some evidence that taking collagen supplements could help with things like joint pain and sort of ligament, soft tissue issues. How well it is absorbed into the body and how well it actually works is still up for debate. I think certain types of collagen work better than others. So bovine collagen seems to work anecdotally seems to work better than marine collagen, for example. I think it's one of those things, if you're going to go down that route, try and get a good quality collagen, so it's got enough of the active ingredient to actually hopefully do some good. But it's all anecdotal because there's very little scientific evidence to say this will work or this won't work.
I don't know, I might be cheeky saying this, but I do think that the long-term fitness to do with menopause, female firefighters and fitness levels, VO2 max and stuff, I do think that needs looking at. We both have concerns about being able to be fit enough to do our jobs to the age of 60 now, obviously just through natural aging, but do things like bone density, menopause, is that going to make it harder for us? Is that being looked into by anybody?
Both men and women experience sarcopenia, which is sort of muscle reduction as we get older. We do tend to accelerate that through menopause. So from a workplace point of view, maybe that is something that needs to be considered when it comes to the operational side. I certainly, having worked for the Air Force for a long time, and obviously they have annual fitness, etc., there's no doubt that there is a difference and a change as we go through perimenopause in terms of VO2 max and muscle density, bone density. In terms of bone density, of course, the more we exercise, the stronger our bones will be, and the more we exercise, the stronger our muscles will be. So it's a bit of a catch-22, but it'd be interesting. I don't know, Hayley, what do you think in terms of the fire service?
It's interesting, having these conversations with Rob and Peter when we were talking about, again, this lunch and learn session up and running, and, my question to them about what was going on nationally at the NFCC around menopause and stuff, because obviously we weren't treading any toes equally, but just interested in what work was going on. And we were talking about menopause needing to be that cross-cutting across the different, so the NFCC is set up with the different groups, but menopause isn't a group on its own. It cross-cuts across the other, so the fitness, I can't remember the name of what they're called, but there's a group in the NFCC that look at fitness, isn't there? That should be something they're considering, exactly that reason. And this is what I go back to what I said when I first started talking today, is around there's a push to get more women in the fire service, and as you say, Katie, women are going to be working longer through their perimenopause and menopause years. So, for me, we do need to start looking at this, because it's going to impact more women. There have probably been examples, well, there definitely have been examples of female operational firefighters working through their menopause years, but we haven't really had that large number. But we're attracting more women, and eventually that's going to catch up with us to having those women in their perimenopause, menopause years. And I think we do need to be looking at it as a sector, and I don't speak from any point of influence here at all. It's my own personal opinion that I do think that as a sector it does need to start looking at these things around how it will impact fitness, etc.
It is worrying. I know it's a conversation I've had multiple times with other female firefighters, that we already feel we're onto a losing battle just through natural aging, but is menopause making it, we all keep ourselves fit, we're all training, we're all doing the fitness test, but is it something that we're going to have to work more against, or is it helping or hindering us, and do we need to know that before we start thinking that we're just getting unfit and we're not able to pass the tests? Could it be because you're going through a phase of, like you said, low estrogen, your body's not, your symptoms and things like that? I do think that is a big concern for operational firefighters.
The lunch and learn certainly will be recorded, and I know that Rob will take it back. I'll certainly take it back, and I do know it's already cross-cutting across a number of NFCC work streams. We're coming to the end of the time that we've got today. I've got a couple more things that I'd like to raise. We've got Teresa's got her hand up, if Teresa can ask, and we've got a question in the chat as well around testosterone and injections and their role in HRT. So Teresa, if you could ask your question first, and then I'll ask Bev to ask the second question, if that's all right.
Yeah, mine's around managing a team with some people going through menopausal symptoms and some not, and having a new manager in who's keen to streamline the systems and make everything more efficient. But some of our systems are quite clunky, I suppose, as a result of trying to support people who are struggling with memory loss. And so we've got lots of lists and checklists and everything they do. There's lots of what some people are seeing as, there's all this extra paper and extra steps that we're all going through. or that they're going through, so they're not as efficient as they could be. But those sort of things that are put in place to help them, and it's trying to sort of, best ways to balance that and not be seen as another thing of, oh, well, it's just everything to do with the menopause, that's all slowing everybody down and our performance.
Have you got any advice on that, Hayley, where you've got a mixed team within your that like Teresa is working with there? How can she manage the mixed needs amongst teams?
Yeah, not just menopause, is it? When you look at neurodiversity as well, and the I say struggles, but that people have with absorbing some sort of information in different ways and change and dealing with change as well. And I think that goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier. I think Bev, you mentioned it. That, a lot of these things that we put in place, they're not just for people going through the menopause symptoms, because there are other things. I was having quite an interesting comment with my chief and talking about the menopause, and he was saying that. He said, "Oh, I think I've got the male version." He was saying it quite, in a supportive way, but he was actually making the point that we need to not just be looking at the impacts of menopause. It's about lots of different things and illnesses and conditions that people have that affect, that their symptoms affect things at work. And although, very, very much focused on menopause symptoms for this particular awareness training stuff, actually, the whole way we take information in is different for different people. And so I think across everything we do, we just need to make sure that we are responding to things in that way, and that we're putting things in place that help people with different, again, need seems the wrong word, but different, my own brain fog coming in now, their own ways that they like to work and their own ways that they like to receive information. And empathy, that's the complete word, isn't it? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. That's what I'm trying to achieve in our organisation, is that people, you can talk about your menopause symptoms and people are empathetic, that they have knowledge and that they understand what you're going through without you feeling like you're being ridiculed or, that somebody will talk negatively about you. We had the same, it wasn't to do with menopause, but it was talking to a couple of female firefighters about periods. And they were saying the same thing. They were saying, actually, when I've got a heavy period, which happens every month, she said, but, some days when I've got PMT, I just want to lie there with a hot water bottle. The last thing I want to do is go out on the drill yard running hose reels out, and so how do we become more empathetic as well as getting the job done? I think finding that balance, I think, is quite a challenge across a number of different things. But I think it's about understanding your team, understanding the people in your team, understanding what their needs are, all things that a good leader would do in an organisation anyway, and seeing what sort of adaptations can be made and what team support could be made for them as well, I think. Because, we all do work in teams, and teamwork is key, isn't it? So if we all understand where each other's coming from, we can help and support each other. The same as it works if someone's going a bit of a tough time in their private life. The team's got their back and they're kind of backing them up at that time they're going through it. So, I think teamwork and really understanding the people in your team and seeing what can be put in place is helpful.
You raise a really good point, though, Hayley. Actually, that my TED talk was about ADHD and menopause and the impact. But actually, I'd be really interested to know the number of neurodivergent personnel employed within the fire service, because the nature of the work would suggest that it would appeal to people perhaps with ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions, certainly things like dyslexia. So some of those measures that you're talking about, the checklists and things, Teresa, for menopause will absolutely help somebody with ADHD, will absolutely help somebody with dyslexia. So it is about recognising that we're all diverse, and that those people that are potentially saying, oh, it's slowing us down, maybe it's just because that's their way of working. But if they're maybe the only one in that whole section that finds that a problem, I think we've got to think more broadly than just menopause, exactly as you say, Hayley.
Well, it's been a really fantastic session. Thank you so much. Firstly, say thank you so much to both Bev and Hayley for sharing so much information and providing us with all that sort of additional support that we can now take away and go back to our services with, whether that's on a personal level or a professional level, to help improve the environments that we're all working with. I don't know if Bev or Hayley, you've got any final takeaway for that, that golden nugget that you have thought about and that you've got from your own experiences, Hayley?
Yeah, I think there's a few people that have commented or put in the comments that they don't think there's anything in their services for the menopause. Go knocking on the door of the people team, or just volunteer if you can, take on that responsibility to start doing some of the work and start championing it. And I think it takes a passionate person to really drive the change in the organisation. All the menopause champions in fire and rescue services are doing it in addition to their day job. You know, this isn't part of my day job as head of media and comms, but I've grown so passionate about it, probably the more I'm going into my own perimenopause stage. It's become something for me that isn't just helping people in my own service, it's helping the fire sector. And I think the more we can do to come together and use our experiences to help. So go knocking on the door of your management team and ask what they're doing about menopause. I think the more we can talk about it and normalise it, the better.
Bev?
For me, it would be just give yourself a bit of grace. Don't be too hard. Have some self-compassion, because you're not incompetent. You're not losing the plot. You're going through a life change. Nobody looks at a teenager. We might question teenagers, but we never think they're losing the plot or there's something defective about them if they're being teenagers and they're going through that same hormonal change. So just have a bit of grace for yourself and actually take some of the pressure off having to be perfect all of the time, because we do that, don't we? We try very hard to be all things to everybody all of the time. And maybe we just can't through this period, and that's okay.
Lovely. Thank you. Wise words. Thank you very much. Thank you both for everything you've done today. Thank you, participants, for the questions and taking part. It doesn't work without you. Thank you very much.